Welcome to Social Studies with Mr. Regas. Today we're going to have part two of our Intro to Economics lesson. In our last lesson, we talked about scarcity, opportunity cost. We then got into some of the concepts behind micro and macroeconomics. All of this, when we start answering the basic economic questions, what will be produced, by whom, for whom, this ends up leading us to our political spectrum. Spectrums are used to show where people stand on an issue. If we're going to place the types of economies on a spectrum, it would look something like this. We would have command on what we would usually put on the left, and then the market economy on the right. So in a command economy, we would see things like communism or centrally planned. Here we're going to see lots of state control, public enterprises, so public meaning like the government owns, and the concept of equality is going to be large here. Over on the right, on the market economy side, we're seeing things like capitalism or laissez faire. People always tell me I pronounce that wrong, so my apologies. In a market economy, we also see private economy or little or no government. Now let's talk about these in greater detail. Capitalism. Well, what are some of our fundamentals of capitalism? We've done this in the past, so some of this is review. But let's clarify some of these terms and remind what they were. Well, competition. The idea of competition is that firms will compete with each other to create better products for cheaper. So, what competition does is it leads to things like innovation, new technology. We could use any good or service out there. To make an example, let's talk about the pants people choose to wear. I think in our last lesson I used hoodies. So clothing is something I apparently am using for these economic examples. But let's say two people, or we have only one type of pants in a society. Let's say they're gray sweatpants. Everybody's wearing gray sweatpants. And we've got two individuals who decide, I bet if we produced a different type of pants, people would buy them. Well, let's say these two people both start making jeans. Well, now people have something to choose. So people are going to start buying some of these jeans. However, if the two people are making the same product, what's going to happen? Well, they're going to be stuck competing with each other, and so they're going to be dropping their price. So the belief here is that instead of people dropping the price to where they don't make any profit, they're either going to innovate and find a cheaper way to produce what they're making, or they're going to create a more specialized product. Oh, you know what? Maybe I'm going to make tights or I'm going to make joggers. So the concept of competition, this leads to our choices. It's one of the reasons why if we go into a grocery store today or a mall, the amount of choices we have is almost overwhelming. This was something that people noticed after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and they came over from centrally planned East Germany and they entered a grocery store in West Germany. They were blown away at the choices people had in a grocery store. We also see private property central to capitalism. So, property, the means of production, these are owned by private individuals. Consumer sovereignty. Well, this means you get to make decisions about how you answer the question of scarcity. No one is telling you what you spend your money on. Supply and demand. We're not going to go over that again, but this essentially dictates what something costs. Then we have a couple other examples here. So, laissez faire and the invisible hand. Well, this is essentially with laissez faire, it means leave it alone. So, there's no government intervention here. No one is telling businesses what they can or cannot do. This, in practice, there is still some government intervention, even in market economies of the world, but the degree of that will change. The invisible hand, though, is an extremely important concept for us to spend a couple minutes talking about. This is something that Adam Smith some people call him the godfather of economics, one of the concepts he created. Essentially, the invisible hand is something that guides every person. Now, what it's guiding you to is making decisions about yourself. The decisions you make are supposed to be in your self interest. So you're making decisions, but you're thinking of yourself. Now, this is kind of related to that economic man, but again, even Adam Smith clarifies that humans are morally, or we act morally, or we should. So it's not that everybody is necessarily selfish or only based on self interest. But the theory of the invisible hand is that you making decisions that are in your self interest will benefit all of society. And so, even though you're acting in your self interest, everybody else benefits. And the argument here is that they benefit more than if you were trying to make decisions based on the greater good. Now, let's use an example here. And this is one that Adam Smith talks about. Here's a quote from Adam Smith. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. Now, what this is kind of saying is we all act in our own self interest, but other people benefit. So let's use the butcher as an example. Why is the butcher butchering meat and creating a storefront to sell all this, right? Is he thinking, oh, I really want everybody to experience this pork chop? It's gonna just be so good for the public good. No, he's doing that because he wants to make money so he can put food on his table and clothe himself, meet his needs and wants. So the person that walks into that store, are they purchasing from the butcher because they feel like, oh, I need to do good. I need to try to promote the public good, so I'm going to give the butcher my money? No, you're doing it because you want a product. However, because of this market transaction, who benefits? Both do. The butcher makes money. The customer gets the product they want. This is the theory of the invisible hand. Now, where does capitalism come from? Well, we have agrarian capitalism. So we see this with things like the Enclosure Acts in England. Fewer landowners with large estates. Landlords are pressured to produce more as population increases. Mercantilism, this is the trade for profit. Monarchs are getting rich. We have protectionist policies. Export, don't import. This was unfair for colonies. Then we have the creation of industrial capitalism, the factory system, and the division of labor. So Britain abandons the protectionist policies in hopes of gaining more products and more profit. Let's just take a quick second though and look at the division of labor. This is also an extremely important economic concept. What division of labor means is that you do a specialized job. And by doing a specialized job, instead of trying to do everything, you are more efficient. And efficiency is one of those market economy goals that is trying to be met. Going back to Adam Smith, he used the example of making pins. He said, I can't remember the exact number. Let's say there's 10 people making pins in a factory. Each person has a very small role in this, and each person does something specialized. They're able to produce tens of thousands of these pins in a day. Whereas if only one person was creating the pins, they would be lucky to maybe even make one in a day. So division of labor increases efficiency, and this efficiency also leads to innovation. So some people, when we start looking at like economic principles, good management would recognize that people who are closest to these stages or steps in production, they're going to be the ones that know how to make innovations. So division of labor can increase in efficiency. So Adam Smith, I've talked about him a few times here. He wrote a very famous book, The Wealth of Nations. Some of the ideas here: minimizing government intervention and taxation in the free market. and then our invisible hand theory, which we've already talked about. Essentially, though, this all works because people are provided with the products that they want. I think it could be argued that Adam Smith was the most influential economist in history. Maybe some people would disagree with me there, but his ideas, even though he wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, are still extremely relevant today. One thing, though, that I personally find interesting about Adam Smith, writing about the free market, is he still does believe in things like public education. So he does believe in certain like public goods that deserve intervention. And so, Wealth of Nations, considered to be the foundation of modern economic theory, Smith was also extremely critical of the mercantilist doctrine. So he demonstrated that trade, when freely initiated, benefits both parties. He argues that specialization in production allows for economies of scale, which improves efficiency and growth. And that the relationship between government and industry was harmful to the general population. And so while mercantilist policies were designed to benefit the government and commercial class, the doctrines of laissez-faire or free markets, which originated with Smith, interpreted economic welfare in a far wider sense of encompassing the entire population. This is a review of mercantilism, mother country and the colonies, getting raw materials, manufacturing them into goods, selling them back to the colonies. Exports are more favorable than imports. So this was something Adam Smith was very critical about. I'll let you read through this on your own. And so modern capitalism. Well, by the end of the 18th century, capitalism is the most dominant system globally. So we see industrialization, the mass production of goods. So starting in Great Britain in the 18th century, we're seeing the Industrial Revolution. Now, what this does is it creates economies of scale. Now, what economies of scale means is that there's a cost advantage that enterprises obtain due to their size. So large companies can produce at a lower cost per unit than a smaller company. Think of if you go to Costco. Everything's in big quantities. You go to buy some toilet paper, you have to get 80 rolls. However, how much does that cost per roll compared to if you went to your local corner store? It's going to be much cheaper. So these economies of scale increase efficiency. And so the larger the size of operations, more efficient, which lowers the cost for consumers. There's also a lot of information and research about how cities or metropolises can increase efficiency as well because you're working around people in similar industries, and this competition ends up benefiting everybody. You also see here international trade, right? If you are an extremely large company that can do things for cheap, this means you can exploit markets. And so we see the justification of free trade policies. We'll look into this stuff later in the unit. Now, who benefits from capitalism? Adam Smith would say that the hardest working, most entrepreneurial person would benefit the most. Why? Well, globalization and capitalism. Most of the world's capitalist in some way. Economies of the world operate on the basis of supply and demand, but you end up having a gap between haves and have-nots, or the rich and the poor. So again, who's benefiting? Well, today, often rich countries, they have the capital to get the resources they desire. And poor countries need the capital. And so they have to sell it at whatever price the industrialized countries dictate. We could call this a race to the bottom. And that doesn't always happen. But again, if you're working hard, you should be able to succeed. If you're entrepreneurial, you should be able to succeed and benefit from capitalism. It's pretty easy to point out at least a few flaws here. However, in general, I think this is extremely true. Now, I'm not going to play this video for you to watch, but you can do that. This is an important, though, economic principle. It's called comparative advantage. Now, this is extremely important, and countries started to notice this after years of mercantilism. The theory of comparative advantage is that Well, for me to break it down really easily, even though you may be able to produce everything, it doesn't mean you should or that it's efficient. So it's better or more efficient to produce what you are best at. This is extremely relevant in today's time because in the past few years, we've seen a big increase in protectionist policies or that belief that, oh, why are we importing so many goods? We should be exporting. I'm personally seeing a lot of people sharing these sort of things on, let's say, Facebook in regards to medical equipment during the COVID-19 crisis. So let's actually talk about that for a second and see why this is comparative advantage. Canada and the United States are extremely industrialized countries. I think you could argue that the United States is the most industrialized country in the world. Canada, though, very similar. Now, back in the 50s, let's say, or the 40s, a lot of what we consumed was manufactured locally, like in our nation. This has changed. Now, why and should it change back? These are some of the things that are being asked through things like trade wars. Well, what do we benefit from another country, let's say China, making, let's say, medical masks during this COVID-19 crisis? Well, we look at things like what's the cost of labor and the cost of production? Well, it's usually cheaper for companies to make things in other countries because of things like the cost of labor. So, who benefits here? Well, people in those other countries benefit because they now have a job. Yes, we can get into talking about low wages, but essentially any wage is better than none. And then a cheaper production equals what for the consumer in Canada? Well, it means the goods are cheaper. So a lot of people are saying, let's bring manufacturing back to Canada, made in Canada. Well, what happens if we were to do that? Well, the price of goods is going to skyrocket because we have to pay people much more. The cost of production here is much higher than in other countries. So, would it be good to do that? I'll let you make the final decision, but who's actually benefiting there? The theory here is that we have other things that we can do really good. Maybe this is aspects of the service industry like software manufacturing or banking. We can do those things a lot better than other countries. And so the theory of comparative advantage would say we should be focusing on that. I heard an economist give an example of her and her husband's relationship at home. And she used cooking and doing the dishes as an example. So the economist who was speaking, she said, I'm a much better cook than my husband, but I'm only a little bit better at doing the dishes. Now, because I'm better at both, should I do both? And the answer was no, right? I have the comparative advantage on cooking, so she said, and so she does all the cooking. Now, because she was only a little bit better than the husband at doing the dishes, he had the comparative advantage there, and so it made sense for him to do it. So we could think about this then in regards to like economic policies today and protectionism. Video for you to watch. Let's talk about communism for a bit. So here's an image for you. Capitalism, it's depicting there's two people turning a crank. They have balls and chains attached to their feet. So they're like prisoners to labor. And who's getting the money? Your rich owner of the means of production with his big fat cigar, right? Whereas communism, the workers are getting the money. Now, this is that kind of basic theory behind it. So where'd it come from? Well, one of the main thinkers behind this is Karl Marx. Kind of looks like Santa Claus. He was a German philosopher. He wrote about class struggle and he believed in revolutionary action. And his belief was that there's two groups of people, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie was rich or upper class. They owned the means of production, though. They owned factories, banks, property, land, and so in doing so, they also have influence over the government. The proletariat, they're the working class. they were taken advantage of, or we could use the term exploited. And so Karl Marx's belief and what he wanted to happen was that eventually the proletariat should rise up in a revolution, overthrow the bourgeoisie, and then through communism, they would all own the means of production. Now, the belief here, like in Karl Marx's version, there actually would be no state. The people would have all control over the means of production. Now, before Marx, this idea of like socialism as a political ideology, it does predate Karl Marx, although his writing irrevocably changed socialism. One of the early ideas here is utopian socialism. So Robert Owen was an American. He advocated public ownership of the means of production and a democratic social organizations and the eradication of all want in society. Now, ironically enough, he was a successful industrial capitalist. Also ironic, one of the reasons Karl Marx that is, was able to write as much as he did was because his partner, Engels, was also a wealthy industrialist. So Robert Owen set up communes on the principles of economic self-sufficiency and democratic decision-making. The picture here is of one of his communes called New Harmony. This was established in 1825 in Indiana. It was one of his most successful attempts at communal living. However, it did ultimately fail because of an inability to be economically independent and to sustain democratic group decision-making. Now, this is sort of a story we see just repeating itself. These idealistic communistic societies failing one after the other. This brings us to someone called Lord Keynes, and he talks about the stages of civilization. So he was a Scottish philosopher from the 18th century. He had a theory illustrating how civilizations progress and change, and this details the forces or how each stage forces changes in the way people think, act, and govern their lives. What he argued was that societies were in constant evolution, making their way to the next stage. So from those primate states to civilized society. And this results in making people more free. In the first one, we see a hunter-gatherer society. This is traditional. The largest social unit is the family, and subsistence living rules. So essentially, you only have as much to survive. There's very little socialization with other groups. And the means of production is just you and yourself. Stage 2, nomadic. This is traditional, much like stage 1. People move around for resources that are required to live, meet new groups, learn new ways of life, and you have the beginning of new roles beyond hunting. And you start to see a little bit of specialization here in the means of production. People who study anthropology look into these different stages as well. Now, one of the things that I personally found interesting reading some anthropologists is that there's actually some theories that as people progressed into these more industrial states, the quality of life potentially declined. People who were roaming around, eating what they found for the day, they actually claim that they had more free time and had a more balanced diet. Now, anyway, that's going off topic here. Stage 3, agricultural. So the traditional economy moves towards sophisticated modern economy here. So we have the agricultural revolution occurring. And when we talk about the industrial revolution, we see things like the enclosure movement and the factory system. Essentially, though, with the agricultural stage, people are settling down, they're living closer to people, and so societies are growing. Capitalism becomes influential, becomes the dominant economic system, and we start seeing the division of labor and specialization, so new jobs. Stage 4, industrial and commercial. So capitalism's in full swing, many areas around the world becoming integrated through trade. However, here we see class inequality. And so the belief, again, was that revolution was needed to create equality. So we see that proletariat versus bourgeoisie, and the goal was to create a worker's paradise. So capitalism established the conditions in which the only way for the laborer to survive was by selling her labor power for a wage to the bourgeoisie. Now, this wage capital relationship creates two important outcomes for the worker. So, the first is that the proletariat is alienated from the items being produced because of the division of labor. You're only producing a teeny tiny part of this, or you're a small step in the whole production. Second, the proletariat was vulnerable to exploitation by the owner because they relied on a paid wage to procure the necessities of life. And so, stage five would be that revolution towards communism. So, here we see that workers' paradise. The belief would be you get a big government, and in a perfect socialist state, everyone is working towards a common goods. So, the goals here equality and stability. The question is, what happens next? Now, communism. Let's look at a couple just bits about it. So, factors of production owned by the state. There's a saying, each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Now, the concept behind this is that you will work hard because you know what you're good at and you're going to be happy to contribute to society. Everyone's provided for by those who are able to work, and these people are motivated by self interest. So you're happy to do what you're good at because everybody is benefiting. That's a belief here. Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. Here we see land is used for public purpose. There was a belief in the heavy progressive income tax. So the more you make, the more you're taxed. Now, interesting enough, Adam Smith also argues for a progressive income tax. You then see the centralization of banks and the means of production. Economy is based on agriculture mixed with manufacturing. You have free education for children. So the central government is making the decisions. They own the land and the means of production. Some of the typical characteristics we often see are these central economic plans, which are broken down into 5 year plans. Now, this is something a lot of people like to maybe gloss over, but these 5 year plans, when we look at historical examples in the 20th century, are disasters on some of the largest scales imaginable. In the 30s, Joseph Stalin's 5 year plan of centralization and collectivization of agricultural resources led to the death of over 5 million Ukrainians in the Holodomor. If we look at communist China under Mao Zedong, his 5 year plans led to the largest famine of the past 100 years. Millions upon millions of Chinese dying. Now, in these 5 year plans, it also actually leads to an increase in pollution. We'll talk about that later, though. But resources are allocated to go to the central plan, and then from that central state, they prioritize where things go. The belief is that they're going to be able to mobilize economic resources quickly, and production is based on needs, not wants. Some examples here of countries that would have commanded economies: Cuba, Belarus, North Korea. Now, this is just a little quick thing to show some differences in the two different types of economies and how it might look in the real world. So, government state ownership of industry. Well, state owned enterprises, or in Canada we would call them crown corporations, these are our businesses that are owned by governments. China has the largest number of these, 51,000, employing 20.2 million people. Here's some other numbers of countries and how many state owned enterprises they have. This gives you just a bit of an idea of what sort of government ownership of industry exists. Now, Canada has 47 at the federal level, many more at the provincial level, and it employs approximately 86,000 individuals in Canada. Distribution of resources. This is going way back to the beginning of our economics talk. How does government distribute their resources? One example of distribution is through healthcare. So here's some countries that have and do not have universal healthcare. An interesting comparison, though, between Canada and the United States is that the United States actually spends about twice per person on healthcare that Canada does, even though it is not universal. Cost of tuition is another example. So this gives you some different ideas of, the economic goals a society has and what they do to meet them. So some countries have free post secondary education. So you would see there's a lot of value here. And then others, it's all private. Maternity leave is another example, right? What sort of social benefits are we willing to give people? So, what sort of government help are we willing to have? And ultimately, the different decisions here do impact things like life expectancy. Anyway, that is our introduction to economics. This was very quick. It's a nutshell of some economic principles. We're going to use this, though, to understand the rest of the unit.